and who, as I understand, a railroad buff, is going to tell us about something about railroads and what changes and things they've brought about in Boone County.
Well, my love of railroads goes back to when I was a very young boy. My parents, I grew up in Florence, and my father was from Grant County, and he was a member of the Primitive Baptist Church in Grant County, and I think twice a month he met his brother who lived in Covington, and they would travel to Dry Ridge. Frequently, we would ride with them, and being a young boy, I was always fascinated with the trains. And I was particularly fascinated when you go to Walton, because I'd see not one track, but there was like 2 tracks, and you'd see different trains on them, and I just couldn't figure out how could that be? What was that all about? And so it was something that has always fascinated me and my brother. My brothers, we've both been into model railroading to some degree, but beyond that, we've always been fascinated with trains and what they've meant. And that's what kind of has led me to this presentation tonight. I have a lot of good information that I've received from a number of people that have helped me. I've researched books from the Southern Railway Society on the history of the railroad, from the L&N Railroad. I had a great manuscript that I've got from Dr. Tincotti on Cincinnati's chronic want of Southern Railway. I must admit, I didn't go into a lot of the deep research of all the books and the newspapers and this type of thing. And the presentation I'm giving tonight, I'm borrowing from the information that I've acquired from these individuals. So, but I thought it was extremely interesting. I found things that I didn't even realize was part of the history of this. To understand history, you have to go back to the beginning before railroads. And what happened in the early development of Boone County, and I think probably everyone in here could say this part, the settlements in Boone County started based on transportation. And of course, the earliest form of transportation was probably the river, and then the steamboats. So the earliest settlements in Boone County were cities like Petersburg, Bellevue, Hamilton's Landing. These were among the very early towns that were developed along the river, Petersburg being the largest. One of the next towns that was being developed in Boone County was probably Wilmington, which was later called Burlington, and it was inland. But of course, from Wilmington, if they wanted to go to Cincinnati, they had to travel a road to the river, and then get a steamboat and go upriver to Cincinnati. Or they could travel by a road over to catch the Ridge Road and travel that road on to Cincinnati. Well, where the Ridge Road met with what was later called the Covington-Georgetown Pike, it followed the ridge. Now, the ridge was quite important, and I read one of the manuscripts was saying that the ridge that goes from the greater Cincinnati airport south to Williamstown, almost due north-south. As we can see, it's probably one of the highest ridges in this part of the country, but it was also, I think I read that it was like a dimple of the Appalachian Mountains, which caused that ridge. But anyway, it was excellent for transportation. And of course, before we had roads here, it was buffalo traces and Indian trails and everything followed this ridge. Well, the ridge was a natural place for settlement. And when the Ridge Road was meeting at the crossroads of what is now Florence, there was also the road that went 6 miles west to Wilmington or Burlington. And then at that crossroads, there started in 1821, a young lawyer by the name of Thomas Madden came out from Covington, and he decided to establish a tavern at the crossroads. And Thomas Madden, along with Wilhelm Wilhot, Henry Chrysler, and Jacob Connor, laid out the village of a town. They said, this is a pretty nice place for a town. And this was the very beginning of Florence. Well, they decided to go ahead and call the village Maddentown, since he had settled up his tavern. Well, not too long after that, he sold his property and left. Well, Jacob Connor, who was probably the predominant landowner, they decided to name the town after him, and it became Connorsville. So about 1829, they petitioned the U.S. government to establish a post office in the town, but the post office soon informed them that there was another town named Connorsville in Harrison County. So the town trustees held an election, and there were 25 people voting, and 16 votes were cast for the name of Florence. And so by an act of the Kentucky Legislature on January 28, 1830, the town of Florence was incorporated with a population of 63. Most of the people in the population was age 40 and under at that time. I think there were maybe only one or two people who was over the age of 40. So it was a young town, and people were starting. And the area of the town that was set up by the original legislature was less than 5 acres in size. It was a strip along this Georgetown Pike, about 900 feet long, and it went back at least about 100 feet back from the roadway. And that was the town of Florence in its very beginning. And it stayed that way for at least the next 10 years. And by 1840, it had increased in size by the legislature again. And over this period of time, the town of Florence grew. And there were all kinds of businesses that started. There were physicians, there were blacksmith shops, and all kinds of businesses that were developing around these crossroads. And of course, I talked about the road to Burlington. Later, they developed a road going southwest toward Union. And then also they developed what was called the Anderson Ferry Road. Now, most people around here would remember Price Pike. Originally, it was called the Anderson Ferry Road because it went straight north and of course connected with the Anderson Ferry, which I believe started operation in the early 1800s. So that road was, of course, a little less popular, but that was the primary road. So as you can see, Florence was a big junction with a lot of roads coming in, so naturally there was a lot of development. And by the time Florence reached 1870, the town's population had peaked at 374 people from the original 63. Now, 374 was probably the highest the population got, because within the next 20 years, the population shrank. But just to look at that point in time, the population was broken down, and I was looking at the figures. It said native white Kentucky-born people, 239, native whites from other states, 62, foreign-born white people, 39. There was 31 black people, 31, and then also 3 black people from other states that were born. This made the population of 374. The town had an assortment of occupations to serve the surrounding community. It included 3 tailors, 4 teamsters, 3 plasterers, 2 painters, 2 shoemakers, 3 physicians, 1 druggist, a variety of retail establishment, and hucksters. Now, I'm not sure what hucksters were, but I believe were these like tavern or bar owners?
Salespeople.
They
Yeah.
had trucks. They took groceries and stuff around and
Okay.
sold them to the people in the
Well,
neighborhood.
this would have been wagons in 1870. Right. Okay. Well, at that time, just to give you an idea of the predominance of Florence, you have to remember that the Georgetown Pike from Covington to Georgetown, and I know I'm going past this, but the road was established and built between the years of 1820 and 1840. And Florence was very popular because it had 2 large hotels to take care of the people who were coming through, and you had a lot of farmers who were driving their cattle and pigs through the town, and I believe behind the one hotel where Girard Street is now, there used to be some big open pens in the back where they could keep their cattle overnight while they stayed in the hotels, and then they drive them on to Cincinnati the next day. Well, of course, to the people in Florence, to keep from having their flowers trampled, they had to have fences in front of the next to the street to keep the animals from coming into their yards. So you saw quite a bit of that in those days. But by 1872, the Cincinnati Southern Railway, which is owned by Cincinnati, was authorized to the state of Kentucky to survey a route through numerous counties in Kentucky, including Boone. Town lore, and I cannot find anything that this was actual fact, but from everything I've read, it says town lore says that the citizens of Florence asked the railroad not to come through the town. They didn't want the noise, the dirt, or the hobos. So, in that case, in any case, the railroad crossed the Covington to Georgetown Turnpike through a wooded area about 2 miles northeast of Florence, and it proceeded south and east of the town. Florence was probably the largest town in the Covington-Lexington Turnpike that was not served by the railroad. And this had quite an impact because by the time the railroads went through, cattlemen, instead of driving their cattle through Florence, were putting them on trains, because by 1870, the Cincinnati, it's called the Louisville, Cincinnati, and Lexington Railroad, the LCL, was going through Walton. So people were going to Walton with their cattle, loading them on the trains, and it was much cheaper to send their cattle in. So they were not coming through Florence anymore. To give you an idea of one of the opulent places in Florence, I was reading about the Southern Hotel. This was located at the corner of what is now Girard in Maine, and it was located where the Nestors, where Jenny lived now. And the Southern Hotel was the largest establishment in town. It contained 21 rooms, each with a fireplace and a very large dining room. There were 7 wells and cisterns that furnished water for this hotel. It may have well been the best hotel between Covington and Georgetown on the Lexington Pike at that time. And it was also the first stagecoach stop out of Covington. After the stages came up from Covington, the horses were quite tired after coming up the hill, and it was the first stage stop. And then from there they went on toward Walton, I believe, to the Gaines Tavern and south from there. But that gives you an idea of what things was like before the railroads. After the railroads came through, obviously the population was moving to Erlanger. At that time, when the railroad crossed this wooded area northeast of Cincinnati, I understand that there was the State Gazette showed a place called Greenwood Lake, and it said that it was a nice summer place, a charming place for summer residents for Cincinnati merchants. So they were advertising to the merchants of Cincinnati to ride the trains out to Greenwood Lake to stay for the weekend. And I imagine many of them said this is a pretty nice place, and before long a town got established. And there were other things that caused a lot of the movement of businesses to Erlanger, but the railroad was definitely the predominant thing that caused that, because of transportation. To continue about Florence, I guess they realized the problem of not letting the railroad come through the town. So years later, there was hopes in the 1890s that a railroad was proposed to run from Cincinnati to Louisville. But the problem was they needed $100,000 for the project. And of course, they couldn't get the money, and it was dropped. And Florence was hoping this railroad would come through Florence, but it did not. And then about the same time, electric railways were getting very popular, such as streetcars and this type of thing. So the city council granted permission to lay tracks on Main Street and bring this out to Florence. But it never came to Florence. It didn't even come to Erlanger. In fact, most of you remember the streetcars ended in Fort Mitchell across from Orphanage Road at Dixie Highway. But that was kind of what happened to Florence. Let's shift our thought to Walton. Walton was first known as the Dry Ridge, 20 miles from the mouth of the Licking River. And the first when I was reading this, Archibald Reed was a name that appeared frequently in the early records of Campbell County. You have to remember, before Boone County was established in 1798, that this territory was called Campbell County. So Campbell County ran everything here. He was appointed to help establish the boundaries for 1,000 acres of land warrants for the agents and owners who wanted their land recorded officially. In other words, he was like a surveyor and this type of thing. And then he was among the first men in Campbell County to apply for a tavern permit on this dry ridge. And keep in mind, when I say dry ridge, I'm not talking about the city dry ridge, because it was named for being on that same ridge. But they're referring to the area around Walton, what we know as Walton today, when they talked about this dry ridge. When the first Boone County Court was assembled on June 17, 1799, Mr. Reed served as one of the justices. His home, where he lived, was a landmark, because if you look at the county line between Boone and Campbell in those days, it's Kenton now, it goes north-south, and then just about the point where Gaines Tavern is, it makes a degree, it moves to the south a little bit of a degree. It's called, it made a turn from south 11 degrees east to south 4.5 degrees west. Now, I don't understand all those terms, but if you look at a county line, you'll see it comes straight down, and it turns a little bit southeast. Well, his house was known to be exactly 1/2 mile east of that point where it turned, and was sort of a landmark in those days. His Distilling House was the first recorded in Boone County, and it was used as a tavern, and it was operated by James Matthews, who was an overseer for the Ridge Road. Now, the Ridge Road was the road that they had in that part of it, basically follows US 25 today. By 1805, Archibald Reed is no longer on the tax books. We're not sure what happened to him in Boone County. A newcomer, Abner LeGrand Gaines, appeared with his family shortly before 1804. He became a justice of Boone County on October 30th, 1805, and served faithfully until June 6, 1817. Then he was appointed sheriff, and I believe one of the first things he asked, becoming sheriff, is he wanted a new jail. So they did that. And I believe he died in the 1840s, and they said he was a very honorable gentleman when he passed away. Meanwhile, in 1913, he purchased land that was once owned by Archibald Reed, which was the site of the tavern for years. And then Abner Gaines continued this tavern operation, and his stand was a well-known stop on the Georgetown Loop. In fact, he began operations of the stagecoach on May 16, 1818, and the passenger fare was 10 cents per mile, and they allowed each passenger to carry 14 pounds of luggage with them on the stagecoach. And if you had as much as 100 pounds, you had to pay the full fare of being a passenger again. The ride from Covington to Lexington took 36 hours. Obviously, the road was deplorable in 1818. Well, when the Covington to Georgetown Turnpike was chartered and approved on February 18th of 1819, the road was finally completed in 1840. And of course, there was a lot of work over the next 20 years of building that road. And of course, I believe it was probably crushed stone and this type of thing, but it made it much better than the muddy ruts and everything that they had to ride on earlier. So after the this pike was finished, instead of taking 36 hours to go from Cincinnati to Lexington, it was taking only 12 hours. And also, Walton was also known on the southeast. It was known on the southeast tip of Boone County, and it was near the highest point in Boone County. According to Lewis Collins' 1847 Kentucky history, it was the smallest town in the county with 1 tavern, 2 tobacco factories, and a population of 50. Walton was undoubtedly, by 1847, still the smallest town in the county. But within 15 years, or 50 years, excuse me, not 15, 50 years, by 1897, Walton grew to become the largest town in the county with a population of 538, which exceeded that figure I told for Florence, which was 364. Okay, now I'm going to change the thought here. Let's talk about railroads. Cincinnati's chronic want for a southern railroad. Well, Cincinnati had of course, had the rivers for transportation and used them extensively. But in the early 1800s, railroads were starting to appear from the north into Cincinnati. But Cincinnati wanted railroads moving south. And as early as August 1835, a Daniel Drake, a physician and a Cincinnati booster, attended a meeting held to discuss the possibility of constructing a southern railroad between Covington or Newport to Paris, Kentucky. He challenged the attendees to pursue a loftier aims of having this railroad go all the way to Charleston, South Carolina. Unfortunately, the Depression of 1837 shattered those plans and that endeavor, so that did not come about. In 1847, 10 years later, plans for a railroad from Covington or Newport to Lexington were resurrected. It would be called the Licking and Lexington Railroad Company. Well, as a result, since they hadn't decided whether it was going to be in Newport or Cincinnati, they had to try to sell stock. Well, nobody wanted to invest in this railroad since they hadn't decided where the northern terminus was. So after a week, that folded. Well, 2 years later, in 1849, the Kentucky General Assembly passed a charter renaming the railroad the Covington and Lexington Railroad. They allowed $100,000 in stock to be issued, and they invited people in Covington, Lexington, and the counties along the way to respond, and they did respond favorably. Well, Cincinnati, thinking, oh boy, we got our Southern Railroad, they loaned this new endeavor $100,000, and this funded and secured the construction to start in 1850, and the railroad was finished in 1854. Well, meanwhile, in 1850 and 51, delegates from Ohio went to Columbus to draft a new state constitution. They inserted a new phrase prohibiting local governments from subscribing to stock in private or joint companies, and further from even making loans to such adventures. So, in other words, they said, yeah, you can't loan money to a railroad company like that. So Cincinnati could no longer invest in what they wanted to expand railroads, or they couldn't invest in private concerns anymore. But in contrast, Kentucky law did not prohibit Louisville from lending financial assistance to railroad enterprises. In 1859, the Louisville-Nashville Railroad opened to Tennessee from Louisville, and it really fueled renewed attempts from Cincinnati to try to extend this Covington and Lexington Railroad southward. But by this time, the C&L Railroad was commonly referred to as the Kentucky Central Railroad. And the Kentucky Central Railroad was the one that terminated in Covington and went south to Paris and Lexington at that time. Now, something else that happened at that time, there was a smaller railroad that was trying to extend further south, and it was called the Lexington and Danville Railroad. But they only built the railroad as far as Nicholsonville, which is about 6 or 7 miles south of Lexington. But they didn't go any further because of the big gorge at the Kentucky River. And they couldn't get enough money to build a bridge to cross that gorge. So efforts, by that time, the Civil War was raging, and even the War Department was trying to secure funds to build this bridge so they could move troops southward toward Tennessee. But when they explored that, they found out it was too costly and it couldn't be done in time for troop movement, so that plan was abandoned. So after the war in 1867, Cincinnati felt confident that she finally had a railroad connection to the south when the Louisville, Cincinnati, and Lexington Railroad, which at this time was running from Louisville, LaGrange to Frankfort and Lexington. They decided to build a railroad from LaGrange, which connected into Louisville, up to Covington. And it was known as the Short Line Railroad. So construction began on this branch line, and in 1869 it was completed to Covington, and then 3 years later it was extended across to Newport and into Cincinnati. But it was simply called the Cincinnati Short Line, but it proved to be a major disappointment to the city of Cincinnati. You think, well, hey, they finally got their railroad going south because it would go to Louisville and then they could use the L&N to go further south. But the L&N required the LCL to convert its trackage to standard gauge before allowing this to connect to the L&N. Let me pause for a moment. The gauge of the railroads today is all what we call standard, which is 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. And it's that way throughout the country. Any car from any railroad can go to the other. But in this time, only the northern railroads had what they called standard gauge, 4 foot 8.5 inches. The railroads south of the Ohio River and into the south were all 5 foot gauge, a difference of 3.5 inches. But it meant cars from one railroad could not go on the other if they were going south. So what the L&N was doing, they knew that if they made it standard gauge like the north, then the cars would come to Louisville. And they deliberately made it so that the goods would have to be transferred from those cars into their cars before continuing south. Well, this increased the cost, and it made the railroads incompatible, but they wanted it that way because they wanted to show Cincinnati that they didn't have the upper hand in getting a railroad going south. So, of course, different gauges would force them to break freight at Louisville, and it slowed up the trade and added to the cost. Well, this caused quite a stir in Cincinnati. In 1868, Edward Ferguson, and he's probably been called the father of the Cincinnati Southern Railroad, he knew that the Cincinnati could not invest in other railroads, but he drafted a bill that would allow Cincinnati to construct its own Southern Railroad that would be owned by the city of Cincinnati. So on May 4th, it passed Ohio State and Senate in the House in the state of Ohio. And he got this through, and it passed. And by the summer of 1869, City Council proposed the railroad to be built to Chattanooga. They held an election, and that summer, it passed, and they appointed 5 trustees when the measure was passed by the voters. So in January of 1870, the trustees of the Cincinnati Southern Railroad were obtaining charters from Tennessee and Kentucky to allow the railroads to pass through. Tennessee passed it after a very short session, no problem. They were happy to have the railroad come through. But Kentucky was less cooperative. For 2 years, this thing held up. They wouldn't allow it to go through because the Louisville interest in the legislature successfully kept this Southern Railway bill from passing. They were finally persuaded by General John C. Breckinridge. He was a former Vice President of the United States and, of course, late Secretary of War in the Confederacy. And he persuaded the group to allow this railroad to be put through by the city of Cincinnati. So in February of 1872, the Cincinnati Southern Railway obtained the Kentucky Charter. It required the Cincinnati Southern to settle on a location by February of 1874. They gave them 2 years to get their route settled. Well, originally the trustees thought, well, we've got this Kentucky Central. Let's buy this railroad. We'll get permission to use the bridge that the LCL is using and cross the river, and then get on use the Kentucky Central as the core to go south. But however, the ownership of the Kentucky Central Railroad was tied up in litigation at that time, and it prevented them from purchasing. So they decided to do a new route, and they decided to use the Ridge Road area and also to follow it straight south and go all the way to Chattanooga, Tennessee. And it was quite an endeavor in those days to do that. So they sold $10 million in bonds, and the actual construction began in 1873, and it was finished in 1880. The final cost was $8 million over budget. You can imagine how much that was in those days. Interest alone was $1.25 million a year, in which the Cincinnatians had to pay out every year. But they persevered. They even turned off the street lights on moonlit nights just to save money to pay these bonds. So the Cincinnati Southern followed the Lexington Pike south from Devon so closely that Boone Countyans that were using the pike during the construction were at a loss to know which was the pike and which was the railroad, because you see, following that ridge, both wanted to use the advantage of the road. So when they were coming through and grading and everything for the railroad, I guess it must have torn up their highway. In fact, it was so bad that it was very muddy and dusty and very difficult to use. But in September of 1881, well, anyway, the railroad was finally built through Boone County, and it was finished at Somerset in 1877. And they had 3 trains running on it every day, and by 1880 it was completed to Chattanooga. The next part of the story is interesting because when the railroad was finished in 1880, they wanted to lease it to someone that would maintain the travel. So they opened it out for lease. In September of 1881, they were accepted its most handsome lease bid, and it was offered by a Frederick Wolf and Associates of New York. Wolf, in turn, assigned this lease to a newly incorporated railroad called the Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Texas Pacific Railroad, initial CNO&TP, in October of 1881. The CNO&TP was part of an English syndicate controlled by Baron Frederick Emile d'Erlanger of Emile Erlanger and Company bankers in Paris. Now, there's quite a story about Baron Frederick Emile Erlanger, because he was part of a wealthy family from Germany, and there were wars and stuff, and he moved to England and then to Paris, but he had offices in those areas at the time. But he was quite interested in investing in mines and railroads in various countries around the world. Well, before he got this lease for the Cincinnati Southern, he had already purchased, in 1877, he had purchased the Alabama and Chattanooga Railroad and renamed it the Alabama Great Southern Railroad, and it connected Chattanooga with Meridian, Mississippi. Then he turned around and he purchased a clear majority of the bonds of a chartered yet unbuilt railroad from New Orleans up to Meridian, Mississippi. So then he supervised the construction of this railroad to connect from New Orleans to Meridian and then on up to Chattanooga. And then finally he got this lease for the Cincinnati Southern, and from there the railroad went on to Cincinnati. So it connected those towns. Finally, finally, when he had this lease, it gave him majority control of 1,165 miles of American railroads linking Cincinnati, the Queen City, with New Orleans, the Crescent City. And thus he gave the name of the Erlanger system the Queen and Crescent Route. And it was known as that from the years when he took it over in 1881 until the Southern Railroad took it over in 1895. With the lease, the Queen and Crescent system reached deep into the South, paralleling the L&N in importance. Now, I didn't talk that much about the development of the L&N, but the L&N had developed well into the South from Louisville southward. Their routes went through Nashville, and then they went into New Orleans as well, and Pensacola, Florida, and other areas like that. But it made the two railroads almost compete with each other as far as who had the best one, and there was competition that occurred years later when the passenger trains were running on those, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the big result of this is it gave Cincinnati, finally, their railroad south, not to mention the additional money it has poured into the city coffers since then. And of course, you heard about, I told you about what happened to Cincinnati and trying to have money for the bonds. Well, once the railroad lease went through, they have been receiving money since then. And they are still receiving it today. You won't hear anybody talk about it, but they are still receiving a huge amount of money every time a train passes into the coffers of the city of Cincinnati, because they own the right-of-way of that railroad to this day. Now, in the local railroad development, in March of 1866, surveyors were in Boone County charting a route of the railroad from Louisville to Covington. And I'm going back to the LCL. There was already a railroad from Louisville to Lexington by way of LaGrange, and a new line would be connected to LaGrange. This is the line of the LCL that was being developed where they laid the railroad in 1866. They started the work in July of 1868, and it was finished in April 18th of 1869. The portion that was built from South Covington to Walton took the longest because there were a number of tunnels and bridges that had to be built, as you well know, on that line coming up to Walton. And I understand they built the road also from LaGrange back toward Walton, and I believe the spike was laid somewhere about 3 to 4 miles west of Walton where the two railroads came together, each end, and that was the LCL. And of course, I told you the LCL, in order to connect, the L&N said, well, if you're going to connect, you've got to make your railroad standard gauge and not the 5-foot gauge that we use here. So they made their railroad standard gauge. And then when it got to Louisville, Louisville had a 4-mile stretch of 3-rail track where trains from both gauge would meet, and they could transfer goods from one to another. I understand these transfer tracks were like 4 miles long in Louisville, where they actually did the transfer from one train to another. Since the L&N, in 1885, the LCL was finally taken over by the L&N Railroad. And then the L&N Railroad decided, well, I don't know, this is something that I've never been able to find out in my research, but in May 30th of 1886, the L&N's gauge was changed from 5-foot to the standard gauge. And they did this in one day. Of course, they did it with a number of years planning. I understand from reading some of the summary of how they did it, about every third tie they would lay a new spike in. It was just 3 inches back from the other one. And they had work crews every mile working on a section, on a mile of track, and they would actually pull the spikes out, move the rails over 3 inches, and then drive the new spikes in. And they had a crew of 5 or 6 for each mile of the right-of-way, all the way down the line working. And on that one day, they moved the rails, and they had crews in the houses moving the wheels in on all the cars and the locomotives. So that must have been quite an endeavor. On the Cincinnati Southern Railroad, we were talking about the LCL, as it was coming through, soon after the completion of the LCL, the Walton began to notice surveyors planting stakes and red flags all over the Lexington Pike. When the railroad construction began in 1874, it was difficult to distinguish the railroad from the Lexington Pike, and travel on the road was quite hazardous. The railroad was finished to Somerset in July of 1877 with freight trains making daily runs. 3 passenger trains started on August 1st of 1877, and the Boone County Recorder began to publish timetables weekly in the paper of these trains. In 1880, the railroad was completed at Chattanooga, a distance of 339 miles. Walton was ready. It had a railroad depot, telegraph service, and a stock pen. And I must say, at this point, Walton was starting to grow by leaps and bounds. Hotels were going in. There was many businesses being developed at that point when these railroads came through, because it was a transportation mecca. Because they not only had railroads going north and south with this Queen and Crescent Limited, which was the Cincinnati Southern, but they also had them going east and west, going to Louisville as well. So you could go to Walton and travel just about anywhere you wanted to go in a very short period of time. Also, Walton, over the next few years, it was like a commuter city, because people would live there and they could work in Cincinnati because they could ride a commuter train from Walton into Cincinnati and come back that evening. And the fare was cheap. It was $5 to ride the train for 1 month back and forth to Cincinnati in those days. And of course, Walton, we've all seen how Walton has boomed since the building of the railroads. It thrived. When I was a kid in the 1940s, Walton was at least double the size of Florence in those days. Like the L&N, the Queen and Crescent route changed its gauge from the 5-foot gauge, which was used in the South, to the standard gauge of 4 foot 8.5 inches in the same year, 1886. I can't help but think that there must have been a mandate from Congress or something which caused all the railroads to do this, but it was done with a lot of planning at the time. In 1895, the Queen and Crescent route that was owned by de Erlanger ended up joining the Southern Railway system. And Southern Railroad, of course, has all the rights in the lease that was passed on by the CNOTP. I remember looking at some of the locomotives a number of years ago, and if a locomotive was dedicated to the route from Cincinnati to Chattanooga, it had a little CNO and TP written under the inscription of Southern Railroad on the locomotive. So that name has stayed with it ever since the beginning, and it's distinguished as being this Cincinnati Southern route. Well, the railroads prospered, as did Walton, and by 1929 there were 28 passenger trains going through Walton every day, and 26 on Sunday. And 8 of these trains stopped in Walton every day. The Southern featured 2 fast trains to Jacksonville, Florida. Both were pulled by Pacific-type steam locomotives painted apple green, trimmed in gold, and they had bright aluminum painted rims and wheels, and they were beautiful engines. They often were clocked going 80 miles an hour through Walton with as many as 10 cars behind them. The most famous of these were the Royal Palm, which left Cincinnati every morning at 7:30 in the morning and arrived in Jacksonville at 7:20 the next day, a distance of 840 miles. Both the L&N and the Southern Railroad had morning and evening trains between Cincinnati and New Orleans. The Southern had the Queen and Crescent Limited and the New Orleans Special. The L&N had the Pan American and the New Orleans Limited. This was a distance of 916 miles, and it was usually made, I think they said the L&N actually made the trip in 23 hours, and the Southern took 24 to make the same trip in those days. And we have seen today what the railroads have done. The railroads have tried to make it safer. I know my brother and I have watched the Southern Railway for years, and they have tried to maintain roads and keep the roads up in real good shape. In fact, a number of years ago, they started doing what they called welded rail. It used to be they'd have a section of rail that maybe be as long as this room, and then they would bolt them together. And then they'd put the next section in, and it would be bolted together. And you'd hear the trains go clickety-clack as they were going down, because they were hitting those separations where the rails were butted together. Well, a number of years ago, the Southern started doing what they call welded steel rail. And they had these big shops, and they welded the ends of the rails together, and then they would put them out on long trains. And these rails were as much as a quarter of a mile long. And they would bring them out on these rail trains and lower them onto the track. And of course, they had mechanical machinery to put them in place. They used to run 85 and 100-pound rail. Now they're running 135-pound rail, which is very heavy. And of course, if you've noticed the Southern, they run some very big, heavy trains through. But the rails, you don't hear as many accidents where trains jump the tracks today like you used to, because they have tried to do everything they can to improve their lives. Unfortunately, they can't get the word out enough for people to watch, look, and listen at the grade crossings. And unfortunately, we've had some horrible accidents we read and heard about in the last year where people have gotten killed by trains. And I just shudder to think about it, because you can't stop a train on a dime. They've got such force, and they're moving so fast when they're coming through. Even if they're moving slow, they can't stop in a hurry. And it's unfortunate. I often say people need to roll the windows down and listen, because the engineer always blows 4 blasts, 2 longs, a short and a long, before he gets to a grade crossing. And it's very important for people to know. But I will say one thing, a lot of the railroads today are trying to close as many grade crossings as they can and have underpasses or bridges to cross them now to make them much safer. One thing I wanted to finish with was something that was quite interesting. I want to go back to the Erlanger, the gentleman that started up the Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Texas Pacific Railroad. There was an interesting story that I read out of the Southern Railway. This was called The Road of the Inventors. And I put this in, and I want to read it verbatim, because I thought it was quite an interesting story. The most spectacular growth of the Southern Railroad and the most romantic associations unfolded on the western borders of the old Confederacy. Early in the Civil War, Jefferson Davis sent 2 former U.S. senators to London and Paris to serve as commissioners. James M. Mason of Virginia and John Slidell of Louisiana were traveling aboard a British steamer called the Trent when a Navy U.S. vessel halted and boarded the ship to arrest the Confederate diplomats. Mason surrendered at once. But when a U.S. lieutenant grasped Slidell to lead him away, Slidell's daughter Matilda clung to her father's neck and repeatedly slapped the young officer. A Marine squad had to subdue the spirited Matilda, and they took Mason and Slidell to their own ship. This Trent affair, as it was called for the British ship Trent, caused an international sensation and moved England to the brink of war as an ally to the Confederacy. It also made Matilda Slidell into a heroine, and it took her to England a few months later when her father was freed from prison and joined her in London. In England, Matilda was wooed and married to the young German-born Baron Erlanger. He was a what is that, I'm trying to remember. He inherited a wealthy and aristocratic banking house that invested in railroads, mines, and other major projects in many nations. This Slidell-Erlanger marriage attracted international attention, and at the end of the Civil War resulted in the investment of some $25 million in Southern railroads, including the lines from Cincinnati to New Orleans, known as the Queen and Crescent route. The towns of Erlanger, Kentucky, and Slidell, Louisiana, near the extremes of the line, recall the romance of the 1860s and the financial role played in the Emil, Erlanger and Company of London in the development of the modern South. Are there any questions? Oh, before I finish, I want to give credit where credit is due. I didn't do this myself. I had a lot of help. First of all, I'd like to recognize Yesterdays by William Conrad, who is deceased. And also I want to recognize from the Northern Kentucky Heritage Magazine the article written by Dr. Paul Tincott on the chronic want of Cincinnati, a Southern railroad. It was published in 1998. And also Florence, Kentucky, the First Century. It was written by Paul Tanner, History of Florence, which is in this book by Lucille Jones. Also, the Southern Railroad, Road to Invention, the History Book of the Southern, and the Louisville and Nashville Railroad by Kinkert Hurd. And also, I want to give credit for the pictures that I have here from Mr. Bernie Spencer, who does the Northern Kentucky Views. Has anyone been to that website to look at the fantastic history photographs?
Just the dollars there.
Yes, it is great. In fact, Mr. Spencer is with us tonight. And I want to invite any of you that if you haven't looked into it, you are in for a pleasant surprise, because he's got a wealth of photographs, of history photographs in there. And Bernie, are you still taking new pictures?
Always.
Always, okay. If any of you have some interesting old photos that he could add to the collection, I'm sure he'd be happy to get those into his website as well. It's a marvelous thing to be in. I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Correct me if I'm mistaken, I understand that Cincinnati just owns the road bed and the tracks. It does not actually operate any trains.
That is correct. And it's still known as the Cincinnati Southern Railway. That is correct. And I believe the people, the people that run the railroad pay all the taxes and along the line. In fact, if you remember back in the 50s, the main line had been double-tracked all the way from Cincinnati to Chattanooga. And when the Southern Railway put in their centralized control of the railroad, they decided to take out a track every 10 miles because they could control the trains as they were going north and south, and thus they could save taxes and other expenses by having by removing that second line. Something else go ahead, Jack.
Had it not been for the Southern Railroad, brother and I would not probably be here tonight, because it freed the Rouse brothers from Pendleton County, millers, that come up to the mill pond and established a flouring mill there, and then built houses, and consequently we are here now. This was in 1883, according to the 1883 Atlas. So they had to move pretty quick.
Right.
And I'm always reminded that when we grew up, you might say, between the tracks. The Southern was immaculately maintained. If you can remember back, it had black all the way from fence to fence. Was these black cinders and white ballast down through there that the maintenance guys took great desire to straighten that up. As an aside about the Royal Palm, we delighted in watching it come by like that, with all the lights on it, you know, and these people that might have been from who knows. And we were envious of being able to get on that, because if we wanted to go in high school or slightly younger, 47 cents you could board the L&M and arrive at Covington. Standing between the cars, smoking cigarettes like you wouldn't believe, you know. So this was quite an occasion to do this. But as you said, Walton was the hub. Not only was it on the major highway, who, when you left the hills in Covington, for the next 63 miles, you never crossed a creek. It rode the ridge all the way. And if you wanted to go to Worthville, you wanted to go to Sparta or Louisville, you hit the L&M. You want to go to Williamstown or Lexington, you hit the Southern.